Hello everyone, welcome to this first lecture of Dynamics of the Lithosphere. In this first session, we will discuss the Earth structure and the lithospheres. As you already know, the surface of the Earth can be divided into several plates. So, on this diagram here, you see 14 major plates, which are of both oceanic and continental nature. So for example, here in the middle, you see the South American plate, which contains a continental block, as well as a part of it which is oceanic. It is separated from the African plate by the mid-ocean ridge here in the South Atlantic. Some plates are fully oceanic. For example, you see the plate here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which is surrounded by the Ring of Fire. So the different boundaries exhibit various styles of deformation. So the plates will deform at the boundaries. For example, in the subduction zone, you see here an example of the Aleutian subduction zone. The oceanic plate, the Pacific plate, is being subducted into the mantle, which triggers the formation of a volcanic arc and seismicity. So subduction is one type of motion. In the middle of oceans, you have mid-oceanic ridges, and that would be a sketch showing you divergent plate motion, rise of asthenosphere, partial melting, and formation of a spreading center. The third type of plate boundary deformation is the transform type of deformation. So in the transform type of deformation, two plates pass each other. They slide past each other. An example of it would be, for example, the Sant Andreas fault. So it's also the locus of major earthquakes. And that's one type of boundary deformation. Plates do not only deform at their boundaries. You, for example, have in this region here, you see India, and India is indenting Asia, which causes the formation of the currently largest orogen on Earth. So the deformation is not only located at the plate boundary, but the entire Eurasian continent deforms in response to the indentation of the Indian plate. So it's migrating, deformation is migrating inside the plate. Intracontinental deformation also takes place in rifts, for example. So that is the example of the Rheingraben here. And in response to tectonic extension, the lithosphere and the crust can thin, but it doesn't mean that this will lead to the formation of two independent plates. So you have a rift which here has not formed two individual plates and an individual ocean. This is an aborted ocean. So that's an example of intra-plate deformation. For the structure of the Earth, here is a nice drawn to scale model of the Earth. So you see oceans basically and continents at the surface here, and inside this 3D block, a section has been removed in order to be able to see down to the outer core. So the radius of the Earth is about 6,370 kilometers, and it has several layers. So the boundary between the inner and the outer core is located at about 5,150 kilometers, somewhere here. The boundary between the outer core and the mantle is located at about 2,890 kilometers. What we have above this will be mantle. And in this course, we study the dynamics of the lithosphere, and obviously something is missing on this picture. And what's missing on this picture is, of course, the lithosphere. The lithosphere is right there. It's a very thin layer on this model, which is drawn to scale. So the lithosphere is basically contained between 300 and 0 kilometer. It's basically 10 times thinner than the other layers that we were discussing before. So in order to appreciate the lithosphere a bit better, it is nice to use a not to scale section of the Earth. So that's an example of a not to scale section of the Earth, and the outer layer here is the lithosphere. So it comprises the crust and a part of the mantle. So we will talk about a lithospheric mantle or an upper mantle. You can already observe two different types of lithosphere. On one side, a lithosphere which contains a continental crust, and on the other side, a lithosphere that contains an oceanic crust. So we will have an oceanic lithosphere and a continental lithosphere. Let's go back to the scaled model. So what does a lithosphere mean? Lithosphere is the aggregation of two words, lithos, which basically means rock, and sphere, which is a sphere. And usually we associate several terms to the lithosphere. One is the term rigid, one is the term brittle, and often we relate the lithosphere to plates. So why do we associate all these terms? Why do we use them at all? Why is something rigid also brittle? And what's the relation with plates? So as an analogy, think about a glass of wine. So if you break a glass of wine, you will form a lot of fragments, and these will be our plates. Initially, the glass is an elastic, solid material, so it's considered as rigid. And a rigid material, if it is solicited a little bit too much, it will break, and this is why a solid rigid is also brittle. So rigid lithosphere will be brittle, and as a result, it will be able to fragment and form plates. So that's the analogy between a glass of wine and the Earth lithosphere. So the lithosphere is sandwiched between the asthenosphere, which is the upper part of the mantle, and the Earth's surface. Again, it's good to keep in mind that this is a very thin layer with regard to the other layers. It will contain the crust and a lithospheric mantle. So we will have two main sublayers. The lithosphere, in terms of thickness, is different in oceanic domains and continental domains. So it's about 50 to 150 kilometers in oceanic domains, and sometimes above 200 kilometers in the continental domains. So we will have different types of lithospheres, the continental lithosphere and the oceanic lithosphere, and we will discuss the differences in a bit more details. So here's a map that shows you the thickness of the lithosphere. So this is the result of geophysical measurements and processing. So now the map is centered on Europe and Africa. So you see basically continental parts here and there, and you can directly observe that the continents, they appear in the blue colors, and the blue colors, they correspond to large thicknesses. The deep blue are the cratons, cratonic parts of continents, and these have thickness larger than 150 kilometers. So this is where the thickest lithosphere will be found. The non-cratonic crust, you can see it here, it's in orange, such as the oceanic lithosphere, which is close to the margins. It's above 100 kilometers in thickness. The thinner parts in red and white are located inside the oceans, in particular in the location in and nearby mid-ocean ridges, where the asthenosphere is rising towards the surface. So in these areas, the thicknesses are smaller than 90 kilometers. So what causes the difference between the oceanic and the continental lithosphere? One main component is basically the chemistry. So here you have a table with the chemistry of typical rocks for the crust, for continental crust, oceanic crust, and for the mantle. So on that side, you have granite, and going down to the chondrite. It's basically, this is order in terms of acidity. So the continental crust is, in most cases, it's mostly felsic. So it means that the percentage of SiO2 is above 55. In the oceanic crust, it's referred to as mafic, and the percentage of SiO2 is less than 55, and the mantle is referred to as ultramafic. The percentage of SiO2 is less than half, so less than 50. So that's the biggest difference. So the crust, the material that makes up the continental crust and the material that makes up the oceanic crust has a different chemistry, and this will have first order effects. So the main difference between the oceanic and continental lithospheres lies mostly in the nature of their crust. In fact, they are generated in different tectonopetrological context. So let's have a look at this sketchy section through a tectonic system. So you see on one side a divergent margin with an ocean ridge. Asthenosphere is rising and plates are diverging. Then towards the right, you see a subduction zone. This is a convergent margin, so the material is converging at this boundary, and the lithosphere is sinking down in the mantle. So at the first order, the material is generated at the ridges, there, the divergent boundary, and it is then consumed, or it dives into the mantle in the subduction zone, and that's the convergent boundary. Let's focus on the ridge first. So what's happening at the ridge? The mantle is rising, thus the pressure of the rising material, which is hot, drops, and this leads to decompression melting. So if you have a diagram here with depth and temperature, the dashed line will be a solidus line, and this would be the trajectory of a rock that is rising at the mid-ocean ridge. So you see that the rock is below the solidus line initially, and as it rises, it hits the solidus and starts producing partial melts. So that's called decompression melting. And in fact, as a result, the rock the asthenosphere melts, and the melts are extracted inside inside the lithosphere here. And some melts are trapped in the crust, and they form what is called the gabbroid crust. So this is a section through an oceanic crust or oceanic lithosphere. So you will have the gabbroid crust, which has been trapped. So this is the moho here. You have the peridotite below. And the melts which are trapped, they are extruded. These ones are forming the basaltic crust. So that's the shallowest part. So you see that this section is about 6 kilometers here. So you have trapped melts that become gabbros and extruded melts or liquids that become basalts. All these rocks here are mafic, and below the moho you find the peridotite, which are the ultramafic rock. So these rocks are mafic to ultramafic in the oceanic lithosphere, and they contain also a thin layer of sedimentary deposit at the top, often radiolarites. So how do we know the structure of the oceanic lithosphere? It's always something to keep in mind. I mean, this is deep in the ocean, and of course one can now dredge samples at the bottom of oceans or try to core, but a lot of the information comes from field on land geology. So for example, in a zone of ophiolites. So in the belts, in the mountain belts that contains ophiolite, you can study the structure of the ophiolite. So the section which was shown before is actually can be observed in the field, for example, in Oman. So in Oman, you had a abduction happening. So a continental crust here, the Arabian crust, has been overlain by an oceanic plate, basically. So in some regions of the Earth, the ocean is outcropping, and one can go and study the structure of oceanic crust. That's a fantastic picture here of layer number 2, extruded melts. So here you see pilolavas that are now outcropping at the surface of the Earth. Then mid-ocean ridges are active, and they are the main engine that produces oceanic crust and oceanic lithosphere. So here you see the age of the oceanic lithosphere. They are the main ridges. The age is 0, of course, at the center of divergence, and then it becomes older and older as you go closer to the continental margins. So this engine is continuous. It's a running engine. Oceanic lithosphere is being formed continuously. There's a big difference with continental lithosphere. So the generation of continental lithosphere comes, it has different sources. It involves magmatic processes, sedimentary processes, accretion of terrains. So generation of continental crust and continental lithosphere is more complex, and as a result, the continental lithosphere is rather heterogeneous in comparison to oceanic lithosphere. And this is one mechanism of forming continental lithosphere. It's the ocean continent subduction of the Andes here. In this case, the subduction leads to the formation of a very thick arc here. So the crust is thickening here because melting in the subduction regime leads to the emplacement of numerous batholites. So you can produce material by dehydrating or hydrating the mantle due to the dehydration of the slab, and producing melt. So that's one way to transfer mass from subducting plate to overriding plate, and in this case you can form continental crust by subduction. So in arcs, the productivity has been estimated in several studies, and you see that in these specific cases, a productivity of 35 kilometer cube per kilometer per million year has been estimated. Another example here would be the Aleutian ocean subduction zone, and that would be another estimate of arc production. So again, you see the trace here of the subduction zone, here the Aleutian Islands located in the arc, and in this region of the Earth, continental crust is being produced, and the arc productivity has been estimated, again, here in a different study, at about 30 kilometer cube per kilometer per million year. So how does this type of arc end up being part of a continental lithosphere? So you see that this is just an arc so far, but alongside, together with long tectonic history, these arcs may become accreted to a continent. So this is one way to grow continental lithosphere. So here is an example. You have an oceanic subduction, a continental margin on that side, and above this oceanic subduction you form an arc, such as in the Aleutian example just seen before. Together with ongoing convergence, the arc here may be accreted to the subducting margin here. So that's called arc-continent collision, and that is one mechanism of accretion of oceanic arcs onto continents. This map here shows you the age of the continental lithosphere. So that's a huge compilation of data. And you see the ages here ranging from 0 to 3.5 billion years. The patterns here are very complex, and the ages are spanning across a very wide range. So this picture of ages, I think you can see a very clear difference with the trend of ages of the oceanic lithosphere, which here shows you basically the motion or the divergence of the material at the mid-ocean ridge. So here you don't observe this kind of pattern. You observe patches. That's basically because a lot of terrains have been accreted. So most of the continental lithosphere is very old. So a large portion is older than 1.5 and 2 billion years. This is also a big difference with the oceanic lithosphere, which is at oldest 200 million years. So more than 50% of the continental lithosphere was produced during the Archean. So between 4 to 2.5 billion years, most of the crust of the continental lithosphere was generated. And the question is why? So here is an explanation for this. So you see the mean temperature of the mantle with the age of the Earth, starting from 4 billion years to 0. And you see that the mantle temperature is dropping from 1.8 billion is dropping from 1800 degrees to 1300 degrees within about 2 to 2.5 billion years. So there is a drop in the temperature of the mantle because the Earth is cooling. This means that during Archean times, the mantle was much hotter than nowadays, and the mantle was much more prone to partial melting. This is an example of numerical simulation of continental collision and subduction with including variation of the mantle temperature. So you see here an example of a simulation. You have a blue plate, a gray plate, continental lithosphere, oceanic lithosphere. A subduction is taking place. You see a sedimentary wedge. And in a setting, as nowadays, when the mantle is cool, you see this is all purple. So purple means it's not molten. If you take the same simulation, but now take into account 100 degrees more temperature for the mantle, then the mantle wedge here starts to be red. It means it's partially molten. If you increase the temperature of the mantle even more, 200 degrees, then most of the mantle will end up being partially molten. And thus, it will be a source for producing continental crust. So basically, back in the past, things were hotter. The mantle could be molten much easier, and it was just simpler to produce crust. Nowadays, it's much more difficult to produce crust. You can only do it in the subduction zone at a very specific location where you form the arcs. So now the continental crust has also a very different thickness. So in the oceans, the crust is usually thin, less than 10 kilometers, but on continents, the mean continental crust is 40 kilometers thick. In the rifts, it can be 0 if it's fully necked, but it can also reach 70 kilometers in collision zones. So you see, for example, in the Tibet. So what is to be kept in mind is that the difference between the lithospheres, the continental lithospheres and the oceanic lithosphere, is basically the composition of the crust. But who says different composition also says different density. So the felsic rocks typically have density of 2,700 kilograms per meter cube. Mafic rocks are denser, and they basically have a mean density of 2.9 or 2,900 kilograms per meter cube. And the mantle rocks are even denser. They reach densities larger than 3,000 kilograms per meter cube. So that should be a first order effect of such density difference. And this first order effect will be that there will be differences in topography on Earth. That's an image from eTopo, exaggerated by a factor 100, so don't be afraid. This is not the face of the Earth. This is exaggerated. But what's to be seen is that oceans are deep, indeed. The mean depth of ocean is 3.9 kilometers, while the mean continent height is 700 meters. So that's the main difference. This is dense and this is light. In order to explain these topography differences, we will, in the continuation of this lecture, discuss the models of isostatic compensations. So in the next lecture, we will discuss the local isostasy, the model of Airy and Pratt. Thanks for your attention.